Did you miss your deadline to renew your Medicaid coverage? You can still send your completed annual review form to Healthy Connections Medicaid. You may be assigned to another health plan, but you can ask to come back to First Choice within 60 days of renewed Medicaid eligibility. It's your family. It's your choice. First Choice is the right choice. Renew and choose us. Visit selecthealthofsc.com/renew to learn more.
This is a CNA podcast.
Close friends getting closer in Moscow, where Xi Jinping has touched down ahead of what will be a highly anticipated
discussion. Tapping its friendship with Russia in a bid to pursue its ambition to be a global peacemaker.
It's been a year since Vladimir Putin launched his so-called special operation in Ukraine, and it's safe to say it hasn't gone as he planned. What he thought would be a cakewalk to Kyiv has turned into a drawn-out, hard-fought battle with no clear end in sight. Russia is facing unprecedented sanctions, and just before the summit, the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for war crimes with Putin's name on it. Sanctioned and sidelined by much of the international community, he does, however, seem to have one world leader in his corner. Enter Xi Jinping. Fresh from securing an unprecedented third term in power, Xi made his first overseas trip a 3-day visit to Moscow. He said he was very glad to come back to the land of his close neighbor and was confident the visit would be fruitful and give new momentum to the healthy and stable development of Chinese-Russia relations. President Putin played the gracious host and spoke openly about discussing China's 12-point peace plan that included a ceasefire by all parties. For its part, the United States dismissed the plan and the talks.
The world should not be fooled by any tactical move by Russia, supported by China or any other country, to freeze the war on its own terms.
I don't think you can reasonably look at China as impartial in any way. They haven't condemned this this invasion. They haven't stopped buying Russian oil and Russian energy. President Xi saw fit to fly all the way to Moscow, hasn't talked once to President Zelensky, hasn't visited Ukraine.
That was U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, followed by National Security Council spokesman John Kirby, warning against the merits of any peace plan being brokered by China between Russia and Ukraine. For more on China's pivot to peacemaker, I'm joined by CNA's Beijing and Shanghai correspondents, Olivia Siong and Minmin. Welcome, both of you.
Hi, Steve. Good to be here.
Hi, Steve.
Now, we'll speak about China's broader ambitions for its place in the global order and its other moves to play peacemaker a little bit later. But let's start with the recent visit by President Xi to Moscow. Olivia, I'll come to you first. Tell our listeners why this 3-day trip was so significant from China's perspective.
Well, Steve, I think one analyst I was speaking to about Mr. Xi's visit summed it up quite well. He said it was all about striking when the iron is hot. And we have to look at the timing of this visit. The week before Mr. Xi traveled to Moscow, we had been covering China's parliamentary gathering here in Beijing. These are the most important political meetings every year. But this year it was especially important because it marked the completion of a 5-yearly reshuffle of China's top leadership. But it was even more significant this year because after a decade at the helm and years of strategic moves and consolidating power, we saw Xi Jinping being unanimously re-elected by China's legislature for a president breaking third term as China's president. China's parliament is largely ceremonial, so no surprises here. But Mr. Xi, with this reappointment, is now the most powerful Chinese leader in decades. And that set the scene for Mr. Xi going on this trip to Moscow. On the world stage, he's also wanting to portray himself as a global statesman. At the close of the parliamentary meetings, he called for China to play a bigger role in world affairs. That came off that surprise deal that China brokered between Iran and Saudi Arabia on the same day that he was re-elected. And so this is Mr. Xi's first trip to Russia in 4 years, and since the Ukraine war began, China's foreign ministry has repeatedly said that the goal of the visit is peace. And if we were to look at the language that has been used, it's personal. Chinese officials are saying that Mr. Xi, and Mr. Xi himself has said that it's him that has put forth proposals that have formed the fundamentals of China's position on what it calls the Ukraine crisis. not war. Mr. Xi promoting this position paper that China put out that called for a ceasefire and peace talks in Ukraine, which both leaders had agreed to and said that the solution to this crisis are talks going on. But we do know also that the bigger backdrop of this is China facing these ongoing tensions with the US and the West. Likewise, Russia facing those tensions. And the two sides, evidently from the statements that we've seen coming out of the visit, just growing closer together.
Yeah, and that's the next question that I want to put to you, Minmin, on the Beijing-Moscow relationship. White House spokesman John Kirby says, this is a quote from him, "It's a bit of a marriage of convenience, less than it is of affection." Now, what does China get out of its relationship with Russia?
Well, the obvious thing is trade. That's one thing. We know that China has been snapping up Russian oil and coal, and trade with Russia hit a record high last year at $190 billion. But even then, to put it in context, China's trade with Russia only accounts for 3% of China's total trade. So that is a tiny slice of China's trade. So in other words, China is very important to Russia. It is Russia's lifeline after the West imposed these crippling sanctions on it. But Russia isn't as important to China. But the reason why China would want to support Putin, or in China's eyes at least, to remain neutral, is also because Russia is right on its northern doorstep. So if Russia is weakened, it would invite chaos. It's not good for China as well. Remember, they share over 4,000 kilometers of borders. And Russia is also seen as a partner and another opposing pole to the West in this idea of a multipolar world that China wants to create. Russia and China are united in their opposition against what they see as US hegemony.
And speaking of that shared border, Minmin, I understand you just went on a trip to the Sino-Russian border. What did you see there, and what did the residents tell you?
When I went to the border, you really get a sense of how close these two countries are, because there are many shopkeepers there. They used to just make day trips across the border to place orders for their goods. And there are many people who tell me that they grew up with friends who have Russian heritage, or they know someone who's married to a Russian. So there's really a lot of cross-cultural ties. And I went there to speak to people to find out what they really think of the Ukraine war. And nearly all of them tell me that they are supportive of Russia, but not so much because they are against Ukraine. Some of them acknowledge that they really don't know that much about Ukraine, but it's really because they know Russia, they're familiar with Russia. The Russians are their friends, their neighbors, even their loved ones, so they are rooting for them. For the business people, it's a matter of survival. One person put it very plainly to me. She said it's for selfish reasons. If they're doing well, they're going to come across the border to buy the Chinese goods. That makes life better for both sides of the border. But I also want to point out that not everyone may think this way, because it is quite sensitive to discuss one's personal political views in China, especially if they are in opposition to the Chinese government's stance. So I think it's understandable that many people I spoke to say they are supportive of Russia, but I want to also be cognizant of the fact that there could be a silent group that may not want to speak to me if they actually want China to distance itself from Russia. And there are a number of people that I speak to that just say they decline to comment and it's too sensitive for them.
Yeah, that can be one of the challenges in China. I understand you probably will know this much better than most of us firsthand, what it can be like getting sound bites and getting the views of people in China. Olivia, over a year ago, just prior to the war, there was a joint statement from China and Russia which heralded their no-limits partnership. But many analysts say the war in Ukraine actually caught China off guard and has put it in a difficult strategic situation, if you like. Following Mr. Xi's visit to Russia and the statements that have been released, do you think there are limits to this no-limits friendship?
That no-limits friendship announced as Mr. Xi and Mr. Putin met during the Winter Olympics here in Beijing. And that was one of the major headlines. And we saw that during this visit to Moscow, President Putin did say that the bilateral cooperation has truly, quote, unlimited possibilities and prospects. But we also have to point out that, as some very keen China observers have mentioned, that we haven't really seen Chinese officials use the term no-limits partnership all that much since it was first announced last year. Questions still remain over how much Mr. Xi knew or what Mr. Putin exactly told him or did not tell him about his plans to invade Ukraine. China knows it's getting scrutinized for that, and there's international pressure. And so if we were to look at China's narrative, it's trying to keep that the relationship can grow when it comes to bilateral cooperation. And as Minmin has elaborated on, they've talked about now stepping up cooperation with their armed forces, energy cooperation. But when it comes to the Ukraine war, it would seem that China is very keen to call itself a neutral party, saying its position is just and objective. And maybe some would say that that is where China would draw the line, there being a limit in its position on the war. But then there's what's being said and what's being done. Is China actually neutral and objective? And if we look at the language and read between the lines, what we know is China has refused to condemn the war or Russia's invasion. It calls it the Ukraine crisis. We've seen China echo Russia's language and position, including in that joint statement released by the two leaders. It said that the two sides said to resolve the crisis, the legitimate security concerns of all countries must be respected. China doesn't exactly spell out what these legitimate security concerns are, perhaps intentionally keeping it a bit ambiguous. But we do know that China and Russia have both accused the US and NATO for its actions and what it says are fanning the flames of war. The joint statement also said that both sides oppose any unilateral sanctions. And we know that that is a veiled swipe at the US and Western sanctions on Moscow, even if it's not explicitly mentioned as well. The question is just how neutral China is. And we know that at the same time, though, even though there are questions about China's neutrality and how much it's doing to support China, even if it's not obvious about it, we know China is also wanting to be very careful and not being seen to be aiding Russia directly in its war in Ukraine. It has repeatedly denied that it has sent Moscow weapons in Ukraine or allegations that it's even thinking of doing so, because China is well aware that if it does support Russia or is seen to support Russia, there would be consequences and sanctions, which does not bode well for its economy or its relationship with Europe, which it's trying to reboot. So perhaps there's a limit to this no limits friendship, but the limit would be perhaps whatever suits China's interests best.
Yeah, that's very well put, Olivia. Let's talk about Ukraine then for a second, that you mentioned, and its relationship with China. Minmin, Ukraine has been watching the talks closely. President Zelensky has said that he would like to speak to President Xi Jinping following the release of its 12-point peace plan. Is that likely to happen?
Well, given that President Zelensky has said that he will, I think it's possible that it will happen. The Chinese Foreign Ministry has been rather indirect in answering this question as well. The media has been asking them, and they simply said that China maintains communications with all parties. But it's clear that President Xi will want to position China as neutral, and simply visiting Moscow without having any communications with Kyiv doesn't look quite good for Beijing. The question is then what would come out of this phone call with Zelensky, and whether China will really be able to play an honest broker between Ukraine and Russia, because China's 12-point peace plan had called for an immediate ceasefire, and some analysts say that this actually isn't quite fair because it would mean that those territories taken by the Russian side in this invasion will de facto remain under Russian occupation. And Ukraine, on the other hand, will want a complete withdrawal of the Russian troops. So will President Xi be able to put pressure on Putin to move towards that direction? Otherwise, what is in it for Ukraine to come to the table to participate in this peace talks? So, in what would possibly be a major compromise for Ukraine? So these are questions with no easy answers at the moment.
If I may add, there was also another sign of possibly whether or not this phone call between President Xi and Zelensky would happen, because we had also heard a surprise announcement of rare talks between China's new foreign minister, Qin Gang, with the Ukrainian foreign minister, in which China expressed concern about the protracted nature of the war and it escalating. And so that always seen as some sort of signs that there may be more on the cards and possibly high-level talks.
Yeah, watch this space. Next on CNA Correspondent, you'll hear how China's ambitions for peacemaker and global statesman go beyond the war in Ukraine.
He's Singaporean, but he claims to have a Korean father. who is very rich.
He promised my daughter he will make her a wealthy lady.
This case stands out in terms of the audacious ways that Gerald went about to cheat.
This is the story of Singapore's most prolific scammer. Hear how he managed to charm his victims into believing his lies. And we meet him in prison, where he tells us his side of the story. Join me, Tiffany Ang, on this two-part podcast special, The Serial Swindler. The podcast drops in April, and it'll be available on the CNA and Me Listen apps, Spotify, and Apple and Google Podcasts.
Welcome back, I'm Steve Lai, and you're listening to CNA Correspondent. We've been talking about China's role as a peacemaker in the Ukraine-Russia war, but China has played the role of broker before.
After 7 years of tensions, Iran and Saudi Arabia have agreed to restore diplomatic ties. Iranian and Saudi officials announced the agreement after Chinese brokered talks in Beijing this week.
As you heard, Iran and Saudi Arabia agreed on March the 10th to re-establish relations after years of hostility that had threatened stability and security in the Gulf. Hostility that helped fuel conflicts in the Middle East from Yemen to Syria. This deal was brokered by China and was announced after 4 days of previously undisclosed talks in Beijing between top security officials from the two rival Middle East powers. The deal includes the resumption of diplomatic relations and the reopening of embassies within 2 months. We're back with Olivia and Minmin, who are here to talk to me about China's ambitions to play global statesman. Minmin, this caught some of us by surprise. What's the background to this deal?
Well, it was a really surprising turn because what appeared to be deep-seated rivalries that have gone on for decades had been upended by the Chinese. And the US, which has been a central actor in the Middle East, suddenly found themselves on the sidelines at a moment of very significant change. So here you can really see the contrast between the role that America and China plays, because China has always maintained that it does not interfere in the domestic affairs of other countries and it doesn't take sides. And China, of course, is a major customer of both Iranian and Saudi oil. America, on the other hand, has no relationship with Iran and is seen as, in one sense, taking a side in this regional conflict. And there is an acknowledgement that the US could never have pulled off such a deal because they have no leverage over Iran at all. But at this moment, though, there is still a lot of doubt, especially from the West, over how solid such a deal will stand in the long run, because Saudi Arabia and Iran still have 2 months to work things out in this agreement. This is the first major political deal brokered by China in the Middle East, so it's viewed with a lot of skepticism. Everyone is waiting to see how lasting the peace will be and what results it will actually deliver.
Yes, and while we wait for that, we'll speculate a little more. Olivia, it's not hard to notice that the countries that China is engaging with, Russia, Iran, to a certain extent Saudi Arabia, are countries that have difficult relationships with the United States. Is it a question of the enemy of my enemy is my friend?
Well, Steve, maybe to answer that question, if we could think back to last year, if you recall, after the COVID-19 pandemic, President Xi, towards the later part of last year, started making his first trips overseas after being absent from the diplomatic stage in person for practically 3 years due to the pandemic. He met Mr. Putin in Uzbekistan in September. And when talking about the Ukraine war, Mr. Putin had also talked about addressing China's questions and concerns of the war. Mr. Xi also saying that nuclear weapons must not be used in Ukraine in what was seen as a very clear warning and rare warning to Russia, its friend, its good old friend, as China and Mr. Xi have called Mr. Putin. China was seen to be on this charm offensive. I remember covering the G20 summit in Bali in November, and it was obvious that Mr. Xi was looking to reset ties with countries it had faced tensions with over the last few years. Primarily, there was that big meeting between Mr. Xi and US President Joe Biden, which was seen as presenting hopes of a possible detente between these two superpowers. But besides that, I remember we were also covering a whole series of meetings that Mr. Xi had with countries like France, Australia, all seen to be US allies and partners. observers said that it was China hoping to reset ties and to improve ties with these countries, and that there was an effort to mend over some of these areas where there have been tensions. But then there has been a shift in tone, perhaps exacerbated by that alleged spy balloon incident over US airspace. And as China has viewed that it's come under more pressure by the US, the foreign minister recently slammed the US Indo-Pacific strategy, saying that a Ukraine-style crisis should not happen in Asia, as it believes the US is trying to create an Asian version of NATO by shoring up its alliances in the region. China seems to be convinced that its relations with the US are not going to get any better now, given what is happening, which is different from what we had seen last year. And so we saw rare direct criticism of the US from President Xi during those parliamentary meetings, in which Mr. Xi said directly accusing the US of trying to contain China's rise. We see that China seems to be facing increased pressure, Russia as well. It needs friends. Russia provides that, other countries provides that. And we saw military drills being conducted by Russia, China, and Iran. And if we think about what China got out of this trip, yes, there's no breakthrough, but perhaps that's not what exactly it wanted or needed. China had tried to play down expectations, saying that there's no simple solution to a complex issue. Mr. Xi wanting to portray himself as a peacemaker. But if you think about it, nothing has really changed. China has stuck to its position paper that it's put out. It has not provided any shift in that. It has not condemned Russia's war. Neither has it provided any explicit or public support for Mr. Putin as well, instead calling for a ceasefire and peace talks, but not stating that Russia would need to withdraw its troops from Ukraine, which is something that the US and Ukraine and the West wants to see as well. And that being said, China is keen to put itself in sharp contrast from the US. It's saying that China is not providing weapons, it's a neutral party. Instead, it's the US and the West that is escalating the conflict in Ukraine by sending weapons. And that's how China wants to portray things.
Almost like it's taking the high road, would you say?
Yeah, I think it's trying to say, hey, look, we are not a party in this. The US is the one that's escalating the conflict. China can stand here and say that we are here for peace. But of course, there are suspicions and questions about what is said behind the scenes.
And Minmin, when it comes to China and how it engages with and interacts with other countries, it doesn't usually, or in the past, hasn't gotten involved with the politics of other countries. It has always talked about the right for countries to manage their own countries, their own territories. Has there been a shift?
Well, although China has in the past tended to be more trade and investment focused, we also do notice that China uses its size of its economy as leverage over other countries. For instance, when it places sanctions on Australia, for instance, when it's unhappy with some of the things that Australia are doing, for instance, questioning the origins of COVID-19 with China. Even though it says that it doesn't engage in the politics of other countries, it does use economic tools to put political pressure on other countries. And right now, China sees the international environment as increasingly hostile towards it. President Xi came out to publicly say that the US is on a campaign to suppress China. And certainly the fact that the US has been successfully able to rally its allies, for instance, to impose a semiconductor blockade on China, as well as this thing with Ukraine, China has been expressing its concern about the growing expansionism of NATO, because NATO has also been deepening its partnership with Asian partners like Japan and South Korea. These are countries that surround China, and they really increase the sense of threat that China feels. And so China has been on this charm offensive to make friends abroad. And it's always had this one consistent message to Europe, that Europe should maintain strategic autonomy, which in plain words, it really means China doesn't want Europe to align itself with the US. And China also wants to make friends in the Middle East, in Central Asia, and the Global South. It really wants to shore up more credibility for itself as a responsible global player and a force for peace that is an alternative to the US, and to guard against this increasing hostility from the West.
Besides that, I think it's also not forgetting that China also has its concerns. There have been parallels drawn between Ukraine and Taiwan. When we talk about China facing increasing pressure, there are some observers who are saying that China needs to keep its warm relationship with Russia and other countries, given that Mr. Xi has talked about this reunification with Taiwan, and not knowing what that timeline is China gearing up for needed support in case it chooses to act on that?
That is a whole big discussion and something we'll perhaps touch on in another podcast, Olivia, about Taiwan. One last quick question for both of you. Given what we've discussed today about Xi Jinping tightening his grip on power in China, as well as his relationship with Vladimir Putin with respect to the ongoing war in Ukraine, should we expect China then to be more assertive and assert itself more on the global stage going forward? I'll get the thoughts of both of you. Minmin, you first.
China is at a point where its economy is really in a very bad shape after 3 years of zero COVID, and it's got to deal with things like increasing local government debt. The government has been overspending on zero COVID, and then it has a real estate crisis, dealing with all sorts of issues with the economy, and not to mention those economic sanctions on China's semiconductor blockade, and also a potential global recession that could really cause China's exports to fall off the cliff this year and really be a drag instead of a contributor to economic growth. So there are arguments from some quarters that perhaps President Xi needs a foreign policy win to distract its domestic audience from the local domestic issues. But at the same time, China has also repeatedly said in its foreign ministry briefings that China does not seek hegemony or expansionism. It does not interfere in the domestic affairs of other countries. And it's also tried to reassure the global community that it doesn't believe in alliances, it makes friends with everybody, and its friendship with Russia is based on this principle of non-alliance, non-targeting of third parties. So it's hard to say. I believe that China will want to assert itself more, but it's not going to do so in a way that, for instance, place judgment on Saudi Arabia for its human rights issues. It's not going to take actions to retaliate against those things, but where its interests are threatened, it might take a stand, or it might, for instance, come out to try and broker, for instance, a peace deal to just shore up more international credibility and to paint itself as a responsible global player.
So not so much the global policeman that the US likes to play the role as. Olivia, your thoughts?
Well, I think if we're asking whether China will assert itself more on the global stage, we have to ask ourselves, how does China view its place in the world? And as Mr. Xi has been in power in the last decade, he has repeatedly used this phrase. He has said that China has stood up, referencing Mao Zedong. It has grown rich under the reform and opening up period of Deng Xiaoping, and then become strong and is moving towards the center stage. And that's a new era as described under President Xi. And what's become increasingly clear in the last few years is that this is also being seen through the lens of this China-US rivalry. And the bigger battle here, amid the slew of issues that these two superpowers have, is one for geopolitical influence. China in the past has spoken about stepping away from this Cold War mentality. But as one observer pointed out to me, during the Chinese foreign minister's news conference on the sidelines of the parliamentary meetings this year, he referred to a new Cold War when talking about China-Japan relations. It was a slight change in language, perhaps giving us a small sense that China may have the feeling that this new Cold War, even if not explicitly stated, has already begun. And China feels that it's being contained and under pressure from the US. And so with that, we see China bolstering itself for greater tensions with the US and the West. Mr. Xi calling for China to balance its development with national security, building, he says, a great steel wall to protect China's interests. China and President Xi clearly don't see the US backing down anytime soon. And it's clear that China is not going to either.
Guys, that's a great place to stop the discussion for today. Thank you, Olivia and Minmin. It's clear you're both going to be as busy as ever covering China for us going forward.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
As you heard, China is looking to assert itself more on the global stage as it both nurtures its relationships with its allies and pushes back against its adversaries. Whether it will be able to do so peacefully remains to be seen, and this will be the test for its leader, Xi Jinping. The TV version, CNA Correspondent, airs on CNA every Wednesday at 9:30 p.m. You can also listen to it whenever and wherever you like on CNA.Asia and wherever you listen to your podcasts. Do like and subscribe to this podcast version that takes you behind the scenes with our correspondents. Thank you for listening. Our podcast team is made up of Sai Yi-Wind, Crispina Robert, Clara Ong, and me, Steve Lai. CNA Correspondent is taking a short break, and we'll be back with a new season soon.